Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. This is the UCCS speaker series, which we have essentially weekly during the academic year as well as in the summer. Just a brief announcement before we get into today's program, and that's that next week we have in some ways, a related talk on planning for sustainable cities. Um, that'll be at noon Wednesday, July 29th, and for more information, you can go to the UCCS website at uccs.ucdavis.edu. So today we're doing things in a slightly different way than we ordinarily do. It's something of an experiment, but it's facilitated by the fact that we have two quintessential experts, one journalist, one academic scholar and policymaker, who are both deeply knowledgeable of housing policy and have both in their own way worked towards creative solutions for California and for the nation. So instead of our usual format with speeches and PowerPoints, our two speakers will engage in a conversation addressing some of the most important questions affecting housing policy in California, and particularly focused on today as we obviously contend with an ongoing pandemic. We'll also be handling the Q&A question and answer session in a slightly different way. Rather than taking questions live, as we often do, we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please type in your question, and the briefer and as concise as the question can possibly be, the better, using the Zoom Q&A tool. And I will be working diligently in the background to try to sort the questions into appropriate groups and to bring them up to our two speakers towards the end, maybe 15 minutes or 10 minutes before the hour. So now for an introduction of our discussants. So Carol Gallant is the Donald Turner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy and Faculty Director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. She also co-chairs the Policy Advisory Board of the Fisher Center of Real Estate and Urban Economics. Her work seeks to identify, develop, and advance innovative solutions in local, state, and federal housing policy and practice, and derives not only from scholarship, but from her extensive experience as, among other things, Commissioner of the Federal Housing Administration in the Obama administration, President and CEO of Bridge Housing Corporation, and earlier work with local planning boards. And at Berkeley, she teaches graduate courses on housing policy and community development, including a semester-long studio course on the design and finance of affordable housing. Last but not least, she holds degrees not only from Wesleyan, but also from UC Berkeley. She is joined by Connor Doherty, a New York Times economics reporter who focuses on the West Coast, real estate, and wage stagnation among US workers. He was formerly at the Wall Street Journal, and he's author of the book, which you can see entitled behind him, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in California. So I was afraid I was going to forget the title, but thanks for that, Connor. His New York Times series, Cramped and Costly, which covered the Bay Area housing crunch, won the Deadline Club's award for Best Beat Reporting. And he too has a UC pedigree. He's a graduate of UC San Diego. So in a minute, I'll turn things over to Carol and Connor, who will help us understand some of the problems in the California housing market in relation to COVID, and hopefully to look towards solutions. Remember, if you have questions, type them out clearly and concisely in the Q&A tool, and we'll do our best to get everyone's questions answered. And so now we bring you Carol Gallant and Connor Doherty.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and Connor, I can't wait to dive in with you on these topics. We've had many long telephone conversations over the years on your terrific reporting, but I have been really curious about your writing of this book and whether it confirmed or changed your views about housing affordability issues at some base level, being about supply demand problems. And I'm just curious whether the book, the research, changed your views on any of that.
So thank you for having, thank you, Richard, and everyone for having us. Carol, as always, nice to be with you on Zoom. So sociologists call this thing ground truthing, which means it means what it sounds like. You know, you have a bunch of data, you have trends, and you sort of try to go on the ground and talk to people and see, does any of this match up to the conclusions we're getting from data and other kinds of things, and theory, if you will. And I think that the reporting process is kind of like one giant ground truthing operation. And what I think, I came to the conclusion that I believe that supply and demand was clearly at the root of many of the Bay Area's problems. It's hard to ignore that there's many, many, many more jobs than there are housing units. And as long as that persists, people are going to do what they can to get close to that opportunity. They're going to crowd in together. They're going to spend more of their income on rent than they would like to. And this is going to benefit people who already own land. People who, you know, to some extent, in many cases, had nothing to do with the huge jump in jobs. They're just sort of sitting there kind of trading off of it. And so, and I guess fundamentally, I did find that I thought supply was very related to it, but I thought that going in, and I think that I did kind of change my mind about the, not really the extent to which that's responsible for a lot of these problems, but the extent to which building only can get us out of it. So I think there is a way to build our way out of it that would take longer than, you know, that would take many decades. And so there does need to be, I became much more attuned to the need for kind of emergency measures and whatnot. Things like, you know, just affordable housing funds, rent control or rent assistance, maybe light forms of rent control as long as they're not counterproductive. I think that, so I think I became more sympathetic to the kind of triage, if you will. But, and I guess I'll just say real quick, I think I went into this book asking the question, so that's what I think, right? But what I went into this book thinking was, when I kind of really first got started on the book, I started doing a lot of research about how long have people been talking about this. I'm sure this is something near and dear to your heart, but
we've been talking about it a long time.
Yes, exactly. And I find out that, you know, people have written books about the Bay Area's housing. There's literally entire books about the Bay Area's housing problem going back to the late 70s. And so the question I think I asked, and I think the way the book is organized is like, okay, if everyone supposedly agrees, you know, with some minor dissent, but for the most part, there's pretty broad agreement that this is that supply is a big part of the problem. Why is this an impossible thing to solve? You know, people here in theory claim to be very progressive. They claim to be worried about, you know, the less fortunate among us. And they have affirmatively, through things like income taxes and other things, generally expressed those values more so than other states anyway, in reality. But when it comes to this one thing, housing, there's like this glaring inconsistency that for as long as people have identified this problem, people all throughout the political spectrum have found every which way they can to either deny its existence in the most extreme cases or fight any of the common sense solutions that have been put forward. So I think the book really tries to look at people who are trying to change this, who are trying to implement these solutions. Are not all the same solutions, not even all the same politics, but they're all working towards things that have been generally seen as productive, and watching how difficult that is. You know, a 15-year-old girl fighting a landlord who's trying to evict her, a group of young activists trying to show up at planning meetings to speak in favor of more buildings, as you know, a developer trying to build housing on an assembly line so that it's more affordable, a suburban bureaucrat trying to kind of move a more low density community in a slightly more high density way, not even really that intense. And of course, this is all very hard. And so I think while I think solutions are important, I think what the book is trying to show is how difficult the politics are around it. It's not as easy as coming up with a plan. We don't even necessarily need a plan. We just need the will to. We need one, but we have one, and we just need the will to implement it.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
But you are the person who is tasked with coming up with these plans. Or at least
self-appointed
advising them. Well, the Turner Center does a lot of research, some of it longer term. As a consumer of your research, talking about longer term trends, but some of it more shorter term in terms of I don't know what do you want to call it, scorekeeping certain policies, talking about how legislation may or may not, so. As the designated chronicler of problems, my life's a little easier than yours. So, what kind of policies do you think? Your job is to concretely lay some of this out and scorekeep it as it comes out. To what kinds of regulatory fees, costs, all these different things in our toolkit. What is their role in positively or negatively? And obviously the government can be very positive, but can also be part of the problem. What do you see in that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think government, we want government to be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I think, unfortunately, in real estate, it's, for generations, the government policies have both exacerbated certain housing affordability issues, while other times, subsidizing, positive solutions. So it's been on kind of all sides of the challenge, and it just really demonstrates how interrelated adding new housing supply and making it more affordable for more people over the long run is an interconnected task with the market processes. They're inextricably linked, and given our system of government and our system of finance, that's a fact. The other complications, of course, is that it's different levels of government with different kinds of controls and policy inputs. And I think, at least over the past number of years, I have focused on those local and state governmental relationships, because the federal government has done a certain amount in subsidizing housing through mortgage interest deduction for home ownership, through some, funds for people at the very low income end of the scale. But really, other than that, it has kind of abandoned a big role in housing development and adding of supply type programs. So really, it's been left to the state and local governments. And I think that's where we see, the real tension. And I'm sure you saw it in your book. This local control over where to build, at what density to build, is a fundamental tension between the state and the local government, with the state saying we have this huge need that is not being met, and we've got to find creative ways of creating that supply. And that means local governments have to do more in terms of allowing more supply in the places where we want to see it. And I say in the places where we want to see it because, the two other overlays here are the state has incredibly ambitious climate change goals. Some would say not ambitious enough, but certainly more ambitious than many places. And it is really impossible to meet those greenhouse gas, emissions reductions without having housing supply that is closer to transit and closer to where people work than having people mega commute from Stockton to San Francisco for jobs, for example. So it's, those geographic locations are really important to the mix of where you build. And then, of course, we don't need to be further reminded of the racial inequities that the government through its policies at the federal level and the state and local level have created over the years that, are obviously, moral to work on overcoming. So, I've focused on solutions that are around density and around controlling the costs that government is imposing on new development, but at the same time, being quite clear that, like our friend in your who's, doing modular construction, we also, the industry, has to step up too in terms of how we build to make it more cost efficient. So we have to lower the costs, allow more supply to be added, that ultimately together those two things are going to increase broad housing affordability and recognize that our government subsidies for people at the very lowest end of the income scale, which will always be needed, that we reserve those subsidies for those at the lowest end of the scale and try to, through regulatory processes and innovation, create the broader housing affordability supply.
Yeah, I feel like there's this tension between what we say. It feels like there's this tension between some of the values, some of the policies and values we put forth and at the higher levels of government, and then how they're implemented at the lower levels of government. So for instance, we supposedly passed fair housing in 1968 as part of the Civil Rights Act. But many local policies have just basically undone through economic segregation whatever good non-discrimination in housing was supposed to accomplish, right? And so it feels like not only are these different level of governments not sleeving up as well as they should. For instance, you just talked about how state and local governments are basically being asked to backfill the financial burden that the federal government has advocated. They also sometimes have like policies that are diametrically like fighting with each other, or that's how it feels. I'm not sure that they think about it that way, but when I look at, say, a broad goal, less segregated neighborhoods at a federal level, whether or not that's the current policy is another matter, but over many decades, they've through civil rights and other things, tried to pass that. But local governments have, through their own zoning and other technically race neutral policies, have ended up in the same place, right? Meaning they've ended up with more segregated neighborhoods, whether or not that was done, I'm not trying to shame anyone, whether or not that was done intentionally or because it was just considered to be more green or more pleasant. The net effect is that's what's happened. And so I think that's something I feel like I'm always watching, and why the local government, even though I want to be this, I want to be thinking of myself as this broad thinking national reporter, when I looked at the where I thought the real linchpin was, it seemed like the local government was just so much more fundamental to where we're going, and whether or not these solutions we talk about will actually be implemented. And I think partly it's because I don't think a lot of people like to concern themselves with local government. It's just this kind of, oh, you know, these rinky-dink city council meetings. But when we talk about things like schools, when we talk about things like housing, when we talk about things like police, it's like those little meetings are where these fundamental issues are being, you know, are being set and worked out or not worked out. And really, the federal government doesn't even have that much control over it beyond, you know, posturing of presidents notwithstanding. It's really those little tiny governments where these truly essential social issues are worked out. Carol, I think you're a little frozen right now. Richard?
So Carol will probably have to
Okay.
Zoom off and then Zoom back on. And so
Okay. Well,
we'll
anyway,
need to kind of fill the space.
You know what? In our list of questions, we're supposed to be talking about a story in my book where there was a suburb called Lafayette, which I'm sure many people here are at least somewhat familiar with, and it's right on the other side of the hill from Oakland. And you see through some of these suburban policies how a city that is really close to the Bay Area and right along a transit line has found a way to sort of keep itself very low density. And what I tried to sort of think about and show was when you talk to people in a neighborhood like that, they're very protective, and that's to be understood, of, you know, shouldn't we have more say over our local neighborhood? This is our local government, this is our town, right? And I feel like the question I'm trying to ask, and so the story kind of revolves around this city manager trying to get the city to embrace a more dense style, or really to get to embrace this one development that they really have no chance. They basically have to accept. And he gets sued from either end, and it's just this whole mess. And ultimately, it's an 8-year fight for 300 apartments, some of them subsidized, and there's millions and millions of dollars in lawsuits and all these things. And it sort of shows you how if that's 8 years and all these millions of dollars in lawsuits for one development, just multiply that by every city in the Bay Area, by every city in California, by, you know, it's not like NIMBYism is California's creation, every city in the country. And then think to yourself that the cities where that's happening are usually the cities that are right next to, you know, these job centers. And you can sort of see how we have these, you know, these one-off battles sum to potentially trillions of dollars, and define how our cities look and the degree to which they'll be able to add, the degree to which they'll be able to accommodate middle-income people. Carol, we lost you, and I just talked about Lafayette. So
great.
I guess
you're back.
so I was talking about
Sorry about that.
and all these things, and this is a good topical thing. You wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which so it was interesting to read you in my own pages, or the op-ed pages, but, you know, physically the same newspaper. And you basically said, you made which might in some places be considered a controversial statement. The headline, which I know, now you get to say, I don't write the headlines, which is what I've been saying to you for a long time, but now is the time to embrace density. And this was written, you know, in direct reaction to COVID. Now, you wrote this at this time that Andrew Cuomo and other people are saying density is killing us, and, you know, that sort of thing. So tell us why you think, why'd you write this, and why do you believe this, and you know, what was it like writing something like this at precisely the moment that policymakers are saying this is absolutely the wrong idea?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I did write the title.
Okay, good.
in this case, in this case, and, you know, I I wrote it because I could already feel, and it's still going on, it's maybe even gotten stronger, that there's some thought process going on that somehow, given the COVID situation, we don't need to build more housing, and we don't need to build it in communities, you know, close to transit and close to jobs. And I feel like that has been, that narrative is being used by and probably some of your friends in Lafayette, you know, who, you know, don't want to see more housing built, you know, back to that local, the local challenge, which is, you know, there's just a built-in resistance to adding more housing to a community. You know, I have mine, I have my services. I don't want more people on the street. I don't want more people in the schools. I don't, you know, I don't want more people here. And it's the same thing that people said about them, you know, 20 years before they moved there, because I've been around long enough to watch those battles. So, you know, this idea that, you know, density has fostered COVID and made it worse, I really felt like was being used inappropriately by both NIMBYs and, you know, and to some extent perhaps by some in the development community who would, you know, like to keep sprawling, you know, as far as they can sprawl, and not, you know, build smaller homes, you know, in existing locations. So, you know, that's the impetus for writing it. And at the same time, I think, you know, my colleagues at the Furman Center at NYU and others had, you know, just come out with some really good studies that were showing it's not density per se, it's not residential dwelling units, you know, per acre. It is poverty. It is poor people or lower income people who are the essential workforce, so they're more exposed. It is the, you know, your some of the stories from your book, it is the overcrowding of people who can't afford their housing. And so they have multi-generational people piled into a one-bedroom unit. That's not density, that's overcrowding, that's unhealthy. And so I think, you know, really just trying to share a spotlight on let's focus on where the real problems are, and not call it density, or, you know, not kind of blame density. Having said that, I think, you know, an interesting question back to you that has emerged as COVID continues to change our lives and linger so much is, could COVID change the way employers, you know, employ people, people working remotely? You know, is that something that is really going to take off in a way that could change the complexion of where people are going to live, and not need to work and live, you know, in close proximity? You know, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. My, you know, but as part of it in my op-ed piece, but, you know, I still think at the end of the day, places like the Bay Area and Boston and New York and San Diego, that are biotech hubs, that are, you know, healthcare hubs, that are technology hubs, people are still going to want to come together for that, you know, creative energy and business purposes. You know, that, you know, the agglomeration, the economic theory of agglomeration, I think will still hold, and these communities will still have strong housing demand, and particularly strong housing demand from people with more incomes that are going to, you know, kind of challenge the people at the lower end of the income for competing for the same space, which is what we've had, you know, pre-COVID. So I don't know if you agree with that, but that's, I think that, around the edges, yeah, we might have some people move to Tahoe for a year, and telecommute, but I just don't think that's a forever
So
sustainable work and living environment.
yeah, so
What do you think?
I'm with you. I'm basically, I agree with you. If I had to make a gun to the head prediction, I would say I basically 100% agree with you. I'm a little, the thing that gives me some pause is, so cities and pandemics are not a new thing. For thousands of years, these two have gone together. And as we point out, disease spreads more easily in cities, whether it's through overcrowding, or other means. But on the other hand, ideas and economic growth and opportunity spread in cities. And if we live in a world that is considerably low density and we don't have agglomeration economies, as you point out, that world will be considerably poorer. We will all make much less money. It will be considerably less culturally interesting in terms of the kinds of cuisines you can have, the kinds of entertainment you can see, the kinds of music and culture you'll see on the streets, and the kinds of shows you could go to, all these kinds of things density relies on. And on top of that, density is cheaper. You can't build a giant hospital with helicopter landing pads on the roof and infant intensive care units and all these different things we're accustomed to having. When my son was born a year ago, we were very heartened to hear that the NICU was in that, or that the regional NICU was in that hospital. So if there was, God forbid, a problem, which there wasn't, we would be right there. All those kinds of things have to have density. You can't do that in every little place.
Right.
And you can't have UC Berkeley in every little place. And on top of that, when you talk to these people who are moving remotely right now, or you talk to tech companies that have already started moving offices out of the Bay Area before COVID, where do they go? Well, Facebook's biggest office outside of the Bay Area is Seattle. That's not exactly a great housing market. Google has a giant, or it's not giant, but it's relatively giant campus in Boulder. I think it's at 3,000 or 4,000 people, which is big for that city. Go read the local headlines and it sounds just like the complaints in the Bay Area. It's insular, they're jacking up rents, all these sorts of things. Amazon, as you and I have discussed many times, goes through this crazy charade of saying that they're going to really open up this competition to the entire world of where their next headquarters will go, then goes to New York and Washington anyway, then says they're not going to go to New York because New York wasn't going to give them the subsidies they wanted, then opened an office there anyway and bought the Lord and Taylor building. So this sort of idea that companies believe these cities and the density that comes with them is somehow good for generating ideas, and B, the kinds of places that the talent pools they want to be. It seems like that's pretty baked into the system. And it's funny because I hear these arguments, I'm almost stunned that I heard an academic make an argument, I won't say who, I was flabbergasted. I was like, how do they get away with this? And basically said that, the Bay Area is going to be dead because it's too expensive and everyone's going to leave. And I'm like, well, which of those two is it? So my point is that if everyone leaves, the price will go down, and rents are dropping in San Francisco right now.
Yeah, sure.
And you see all these people saying, oh, I'm going to get this new place, I'm going to upgrade, so I think that, I think there will be, now, just to add a little caveat to that, there will be accelerated movements of certain kinds of jobs to places like Phoenix. I wrote a story on that. It was the last story I wrote in the Times before COVID happened. It was about how in Phoenix, I mean, I went to this building in Scottsdale. Yelp has a big office there. Zillow has a big office. You go into this one office building, you could just like walk around and see all the names of these different companies from Austin, Seattle, and San Francisco were the three I saw. And those are sales jobs. They're decent jobs. They're $85,000 a year jobs and whatnot. But they're not. But they're moving those jobs because they are considered less essential than or less core, if you will, than the engineering and stuff. And also, they are jobs that are relatively high income in that market, and so give them a higher end employee. I think that will continue. But
look, that's been going on. I want to go back to the pandemic, but I agree with you, and that's been going on for many, many years. Call centers in India, for the major mortgage servicers, moving jobs to the south of United States for auto workers, and part of that is getting quote unquote getting better working conditions, including shedding the union pressures. I mean, there's all kinds of dynamics like that will always push some employees and some companies to make moves. I think the thing that I worry about the most in this pandemic, I mean, the positive, if there's any silver lining at all, it is that we have exposed just this, huge divide between who we think of as an essential worker and what they earn, and who those folks are. Because even if we have some of the highest end tech workers, move to other locations, or some portion of them, working remotely, I don't think we're going to have rents drop enough, again, without building more supply and without building some dedicated, affordable housing with our resources, for the population that needs to be here to do their service work. It's just they're under extreme pressure right now, and with kind of evictions threatening over their head. And if Congress doesn't increase resources for, to either shore up people's income, like through the unemployment insurance or renters assistance, those are the people who are going to suffer the most today and suffer the most in the long term. So I really I'm spending a lot of my time right now just to maybe step one bit more deeply into the pandemic in writing pieces, and so as the Turner Center, to get both Congress and the state legislature and the governor's office in California to really put some focus on this pending cliff, that happens on July 31st, when, the next set of rent payments are due, and the uninsurance employment, to the extent people have been receiving any kind of assistance, particularly in these high cost markets, it's not enough out here. And, we're just digging ourselves in deeper and deeper in terms of a housing affordability crisis that we'll need to dig out of when this is over. So I'm spending a lot of time.
Let's just put a point on that before we have to go to questions. I'll start with the first question. What should the government be doing to prevent this cliff, as you said, this immediate eviction threat? And then beyond that, how do we use this pandemic to dig out of the hole that you and I just spent 40 minutes talking about? Meaning, even if we prevent this eviction cliff, it's not like housing was wonderful, hence why I wrote a book
right
before that. So
right,
there's short-term, long-term. What do we, I guess you and I kind of talked about the long-term, but how would we use the pandemic to embrace the long-term? So short-term, what do we need to do to stop
Yeah,
this?
I'll give you my quick thoughts. I'd be interested in hearing yours, but you know, we're spending a lot of time convincing policymakers that spending money in the short term to keep people in place, keep people in their homes, so no evictions, and if they can't pay rent or they can't pay a portion of their rent, they either get rental assistance from the government, and that can be you know, there's a lot of ways to do that. And or you give some type of lifeline, particularly to the small landlords, you know, who, you know, just don't have the ability to, you know, if you own a duplex and both of the folks in that duplex can't pay rent or can't pay their whole rent, you know, you're not going to be able to pay your water bill and your operating expenses. And so you're going to get foreclosed on if you have a mortgage. And I think I saw that movie in the single family crisis, you know, during the last recession. And to me, you're going to end up spending more money and causing more harm over a longer term period of time if you're allowing, you know, Wall Street companies to buy these distressed assets and people are out on the street, you know, being homeless. So we're better off keeping both those owners and those renters afloat for a period of time. And I think there are, you know, there are treasury ways of lending money into that system that, you know, gets paid back, you know, 10 years from now. You know, we could do that. You know, it goes back to your earlier points about political will. And, you know, I'm actually cautiously optimistic that, and I think it would be most beneficial if that comes from Congress, because only the federal government can print money and California can't. But if they don't, California needs to have a safety net backup system. And I hope that will be the case. Long term, I think we need to keep our pedal to the metal on all the things that we talked about earlier. We can't let up just, you know, because of this pandemic, to not be thinking about production in the future.
Yeah, I that all sounds perfect. I guess we have to move to questions, but the only comment I would make is, yeah, I mean, as a reporter, the one thing I'm always noticing is the way in which it feels like federalism, not that I'm like saying we should abolish federalism or anything, but there are so many different agencies tasked with, helping to solve the many social problems we have in this country. And each of them is responsible for their own budget. And their temptation then is to try to offload things, offload responsibilities. And what I see that summing up as is problems that cost so much more in dollars, forget the moral outrage for a moment, although that's important, than they would if we just tried to solve them. Homelessness being the perfect example. It definitely, according to various studies, costs much more to deal with emergency room visits, Medicaid funds, all these different things. Children, truancy, I mean, all these kinds of costs that we have, all these kinds of programs to sort of ameliorate. If you sum homelessness up into all of those, it costs so much more than if we either had some combination of rental assistance and affordable housing to deal with this problem. And so I think that we, and I understand that if you're a city council, you can't pass, you are not capable of passing, LA just passed $100 million rental fund, and it was like oversubscribed in like a week or a day or so,
Right. And I think that came from federal federal assistance
Yes, it
money
came
too.
from CARES, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
So, but my point is that that these local that all these different levels of government are basically at some level trying to do the same things besides domestically, you know, obviously defense and other things that the federal government has sole responsibility for. And by offloading these responsibilities and kicking them down in different places, we end up spending like so much more money. And it's just feels like this giant coordination problem
It,
where
it,
like,
yeah, so I know Richard wants us to go to
yeah,
questions. I'm just going to say I have a whole lecture on this from my housing policy
I'm
class because
sure.
I couldn't agree more. And part of it goes to, you know, Congress has different committees with different jurisdictions, and they write laws, you know, where their committee gets the money to, you know, distribute through Medicare, and, you know, Housing and Financial Services gets the money to, you know, put the money through housing policies. And so like, it starts way up at the structure of the federal government. So we'll stop, Richard, and go to your questions.
Yeah, great. I might just comment that because I personally am doing a hospital rotation this week, you know, talk about the a kind of intersectionality that relates to what you were just saying. We had a patient who was admitted to a surgery service because of trauma, was ready for discharge, but had a psychiatric problem, is homeless, and then turned out to be COVID positive. So this brings everything together. And there was a big debate about where, you know, where this patient stays. And so the result is he's going to be staying in the hospital for the foreseeable time because of lack of mental health services and homeless services and so on. So it does all kind of come together. So there were a number of questions, and I'm sure there will be more. People are encouraged to type in. You addressed kind of a middle ground problem with respect to the eviction cliff, but there was one question, two questions actually, that relate to, on the one hand, the short term and the long term. So the short term question is, what do you think about emergency measures like tent cities and campgrounds and possibly hotels and so on? And then in the longer term, at least with respect to the homeless situation, what has been the impact, or what do you, how would you evaluate the so-called NOFA program, which apparently will provide up to 550 million federal dollars to be spent by the end of December to acquire and rehab properties? So those are two related questions in there.
Yeah, so Connor, I mean, I can jump
once you
in.
say program, it is Carol's question.
Okay.
Let me just say on the emergency measures, you know, there's a huge theoretical divide on this, which is, you know, if you allow temporary situations to exist, you kind of take the pressure off of, and many homeless advocates, you know, fall in this category. You take the pressure off of the funding and the responsibility of, you know, creating the permanent supportive housing solutions that are ultimately needed. I think it's a little hard in the middle of any kind of disaster, and we were in a disaster and homelessness before the pandemic, and we're in one now, not to think about using temporary solutions, but I would want to hook those very closely to you know, the permanent or longer term solutions in terms of a trajectory through. That's easier said than done. On the Project Home Key, which I think is the NOFA that folks are talking about, I think the governor has made a big stand to use the federal dollars to acquire hotels, particularly, you know, one would expect hotels that probably are going to have a very, very hard time recovering themselves, you know. So some of the, I don't want to use a brand name, but, you know, the budget hotels, you know, along, you know, some of the commercial corridors. And, you know, I think that's a really positive fast way of providing places to turn into supportive housing. I think the challenge is that there isn't the long-term support money to go with those along with those acquisitions, and so the localities and the counties have to come up with the money to, you know, keep the services and the operations kind of afloat once they acquire these hotels. So I think that is still to be played out in terms of state assistance and federal assistance for that purpose.
Okay, one kind of big picture question that has arisen is how do we manage the state local tension that Connor you alluded to earlier, and I think Carol you did as well. You know, given that everything you said is consistent with the idea that we have fundamentally a supply problem, but the supply problem is also a political problem. So anyhow, you know, this relates, I think, to something I heard the other day about how local planning commissions are often attended by people who feel most ardently about preserving neighborhood character and so on. But the people who aren't represented there are those whose lives might be improved in the future. Anyway, that's the philosophy. But in terms of actual policy, how do we manage better the state-local relationships?
Philosophically, my feeling about this is that so I try not to get into policy prescriptions too much because it seems slightly inappropriate, you know, but I'm of course comfortable talking about broad goals and economic trends that I, you know, report on, right? And it is pretty clear that the Bay Area has, through policy, allowed for the creation of Bay Area and California more generally, right, and Los Angeles as well, allowed for the creation of, and really just encouraged the creation of many, many, many more jobs than housing units. The result is really you know, shameful homeless problem that we've kind of become something of a national joke with, and you know, people who, but for housing costs, would be doing really well. I mean, we talk about this doom and gloom, but let's just talk a little bit about the positive side for a moment. We have very high wages. We have a really robust, fifth largest economy in the world, right? This could be an economy where everyone is pointing to all the things that are going well, but housing undermines all that. Hence why, despite having some of the highest wages in the country, we have the highest poverty rate. So assuming you want that to end, you have to put houses somewhere in the vicinity, as in like a short enough commute of where those jobs are going. And I see how quickly people in San Francisco and Palo Alto, they are, you know, they go berserk when some housing development is proposed, but I don't feel like I see those same voices when they're building gigantic office towers, or at least historically there haven't. That's now starting to change, right? And so really through their own kind of policies and their own biases, they're definitely, you know, they are affirmatively creating those policies. Palo Alto has 4 jobs per housing unit. Manhattan has like 2. So it's more Manhattan-like than Manhattan if you define it as sort of a hub that people go to, and its nighttime population is much smaller. Okay, so you have to come up with some sort of state policy that basically says that can't persist. You have to have a more balanced growth. I think that obviously somebody in Sacramento is not going to have the view of where they should it go on this corner or that corner, is this marshland, is whatever, you know. The cities probably should have lots of flexibility about how they want to do it. They should be able to have all sorts of cool design. You know, do they want a uniform look where they have all the tall buildings in one place? Or do they want a kind of more Mexico City look where it's just completely, which is kind of fun when you're that, you know, like where it's just jumbled and you'll have like a high rise next to a single family. Maybe that should be up to the communities, but I think there should be, and technically speaking, there is this process already. It's just inept. A process where you basically say, here's what we need to do as a state and as a community. Here's the jobs you are creating as a community. Here's part of your responsibility for that, but you decide how you want to divvy up that housing, but you have to meet these targets, and there will be some sort of regulatory trigger if you don't, right? And I think philosophically, I think that's how it should be done, meaning you can have lots of local debates, but they have to have like a pretty discrete end time.
Can I just, I know we're out of time. If I could just like put a point on this, which is we all at some base level would prefer that decisions get made at a local level. Like that's what democracy is about. But there are times that for the greater good, you have to take that decision up to a higher level of government to create the accountability that Connor was just talking about. And, you know, civil rights is a perfect example. Had you left it to local communities, right, you know, we wouldn't have a Civil Rights Act. Like, you know, and back to one of Connor's earlier points, many communities have been continuing to resist the idea of integrated communities, you know, to this day, vociferously. So there comes a moral and, you know, environmental, you know, imperatives that, you know, if the locals aren't going to make the right decisions, then, or the decisions that are for the greater good, then you've got to take it up to a higher level of your elected representatives.
You have time for one more question?
Sure.
So with the indulgence of the audience and you, I'll sort of compress two into one. It's basically asking about alternative policies that have been developed as models elsewhere. So there was one question about Portland and what the questioner termed an up rather than out strategy. Portland's been in the news for other things lately, but this is about housing. And the other was just models in other countries, things that work, policies that work. And I think we'll close there.
Great. Well, like I say, I think, you know, Portland's urban growth boundaries, and they're not the only ones, you know, kind of creating, you know, the growth boundary, like, you know, we're not going to go beyond this, and we're only going to stay within a certain urban footprint, I think is a great idea. The challenge with that in the Bay Area or in California is, you know, we don't have like New York and a couple in the metropolitan suburbs. You know, we have 100 and some different cities in the Bay Area. And so there's jurisdictional issues of how you would draw, you know, you'd have to draw a regional growth boundary, and you'd have to get all those 101 cities within that boundary, you know, to agree where they're growing and where they're not growing, and at what density they're growing. And, you know, that consensus, I think, would be extremely difficult. And then I guess the one thing I would say from looking at other countries is this idea that what we really need in the US for the lower income, we need to get the supply to work for most of the general population. That's my view, right? With regulatory incentives, with density incentives, but there's always going to be a certain number of people that can't afford, you know, even the cost of operating the apartment unit that, you know, they're going to be living in. And we don't have a universal housing allowance or a universal, you know, amount of income that people could use to, you know, pay for a basic cost of shelter. And, you know, our closest program is the housing voucher program, the Section 8 housing voucher program, that, you know, only 1 in 5 people who are eligible for it from an income perspective get it, because it's attached to a discretionary amount of money. It's not like food stamps where if you qualify, you get it. And I do think we need a more universal basic housing allowance. I don't see any other answer. And, many of the Scandinavian countries, have that type of allowance.
Thanks. Connor, any closing words?
No, that's perfect. I was just thinking about that 1 in 5. I guess I thought it was 1 in 4 statistic.
It changes over time.
So.
Yeah. Well, Connor Doherty, Carol Gallant, thank you very much for being with us. Wonderful presentation, fantastic discussion, and giving us a lot to think about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.